Good morning. Welcome to City Bible Church at Home. My name is Pastor Bill McLean. I'm coming to you from my study, and I believe this is our 7th week, although it feels like our 10th anniversary of the 7 weeks of quarantine. It's actually only 7 weeks that we've been in this. We've been in this study now this is the 12th message from the book of Galatians. I started way back the first Sunday in March, which was the first Sunday in our new building. And with the exception of Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday, we've been in this book each and every Sunday. Next week is Mother's Day. Please do yourself a favor, honor your mother next Sunday morning. Well, this morning, this message I've titled A Friend Forever. A Friend Forever. And a few years ago, a good friend of mine, Rob, and his wife Shelley Hodgkinson, gave me this set of books that you see here, this multicolored set of books. They're the works of Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer was probably one of the greatest minds in the 20th century. He died in 1984. And I just love his stuff. I've added several volumes to that collection. And one of them is a book called The Mark of the Christian. I want you to listen to what he said. He said, "Through the centuries, men have displayed symbols to show they are Christians. They've worn marks in the lapels of their coats. They've hung chains around their necks. They've even had special haircuts. But there is a much better sign, a mark that has not been thought up as a matter of expediency for use on some special occasion. It is a universal mark that is to last throughout all the ages of the church, till the coming of Jesus Christ." What is that mark? Listen to what Schaeffer said. "At the close of his ministry, Jesus looked forward to his death on the cross. Knowing he is about to leave, he prepares his disciples for what is to come. It is here that he makes clear the distinguishing mark of the Christian. He quotes John 13, verses 33 through 35. "Little children, I shall be with you a little while longer. You shall seek me, and as I said to the Jews, where I am going, you cannot come. So now I say to you, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. As I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." 3 times in 2 verses, the Lord Jesus says, love one another. I think he means love one another. So if you keep that in mind, I want you to go with me to Galatians chapter 4, because that's what Paul has on his mind. And we're going to pick it up in verse 12. But let me tell you, first of all, that as you're turning there, you need to know that 8 hours from now, you will have forgotten 90% of what I'm going to say during this message. And the 10% that you do remember will be the stories, the illustrations. But if you follow along in your Bible, if you take notes, you will retain that much more. So I encourage you to get your copy of God's Word, a pen, a paper, something to write on, something to write with. Take some notes and follow along. Now, if you'll remember, Paul has laid down this issue of justification because he wants these Galatians to remember that it was grace and grace alone that saved them. He had been there, he had planted that church, and he preached that it was grace that saves through faith. But then in come these Judaizers and they say, no, grace isn't enough to save you. You need to add to it the law and all of the rules and regulations that go along with that. Well, Paul says, no. It's putting your faith in Jesus Christ, and out of that, works will come naturally. You'll want to serve the Lord Jesus. And then he lays out this amazing doctrine of adoption. And twice he says, you are the sons of God. Isn't that a great part of this epistle? You are now a child of the God of all there is. You bear his name, and you will inherit everything that belongs to the Father because you are a joint heir with Jesus Christ. But then in chapter 4, as we looked at last week, he comes with a warning. And folks, it's one of the most difficult warnings that we find in the New Testament. And he says that if you have tasted the grace of God and you turn from that to the law, then you've turned to an idol. And the law has become an idol. Paul says that there are demons, he says, under the elements of the world that seduce you into worshiping idols. And when you turn from grace, then you're turning to what the demons are luring you into, are pulling you into. He says there is no salvation apart from the grace of Jesus Christ. And so that's the warning. That's the warning that he gives. And I tell you what, it is fearful. It is stern. And it's one of the scariest warnings that we find in the New Testament. I think it's right up there with the 5 warnings we find in the book of Hebrews. But he says that if we depend on anything other than grace and the grace of Jesus Christ that saved you, you are worshiping an idol. And behind that idol is a demon. That's the warning. Now, he says that and things change. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever disciplined your child and said to them, now this is going to hurt you more than it hurts me? You know, I remember being on the receiving end of that and thinking, right, sure it is. Yeah, tell me another one. And then you have your own kids and you begin to understand it a little bit more, right? Well, then you have grandkids, and of course, grandkids are perfect and they do nothing wrong. But get this. Paul has given this warning, and after he gives it, he just opens up his heart. He opens up, and he's going to get into relationships. Now, I ask you this morning, can grace restore and rescue relationships? Well, you bet it can. It sure can. And he's going to turn from this issue of grace in the midst of your relationships, or rather turn to this issue of grace in the midst of your relationships. Whether it's your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with your children, or your relationships with one another in the church or out of the church. He's going to say that these people are wrecking their testimony because there's no evidence of grace within these relationships. He wants them to understand that grace not only saves them, but grace builds deep and lasting relationships. The grace that saves us for eternity is the same grace that builds lasting relationships that are rich and deep. You know, it's grace in salvation and it's grace in sanctification. And that's what I want you to see this morning. And this, by the way, marks a change in the epistle. Right here, there's going to be a change in the epistle. And I was, talking to my wife about this the other day, and about how this series is just speaking to my heart. I have never preached through the book of Galatians. I have never gone deep into it as I have now for this. And I'll tell you what, it's just spoke to my heart in ways that I never believed it would, to be honest with you. I never thought about how it could. But it's amazing how it talks about building relationships. So we're going to start with that this morning. Paul is going to go back to when he first came to Galatia. And we're going to see that, first of all, relationships are empowered when they're infused with grace. Our relationships can be strengthened, they can be restored, renewed, and revived by the grace of God. Now let's pick it up in verse 12. Paul writes and he says, "Brethren, I urge you to become like me, for I became like you." He's saying, trust in Christ and his grace alone. That's what Paul was doing. And he says, do as I do. But then he says, for I became like you. Now, he's talking about the relationship here. And there are two things that I want you to see from their relationship. And the first one is there's an element of consideration, an element of consideration, in a relationship that is built on grace. There is always consideration. You know, as we look back at that one statement in that verse 12, there are two clauses, and the second clause says, "For I became like you." Now let me explain that by taking you back a few pages to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And as you're turning there, I want you to see that he's going to say the same thing back there to the church at Corinth. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19, he says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law." Verse 21, "To those who are without the law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you." He isn't saying here that he compromised the gospel in any way. He's saying that he built relationship with all these different people by getting to know them. It was a consideration on his part to get to know them, to learn what was important to them and where their hearts were. He didn't come in and say, "Listen, I'm going to start a church, and if you want to be a part of that church, you need to wear a coat and tie. You need to dress in a certain way. Ladies, you need to make sure you have your dress on. You need to look like this." He just got to know them. And he made them feel comfortable because he was interested in them and who they were. I love what Tim Keller says about this. He says, if you want to know how to tell if you are not a legalist, it's that you don't make a federal case out of everything. I love that. Paul didn't complain about everything. He didn't worry about, the way they were dressed, whether they had tattoos or piercings or, whether they weren't wearing a tie or they were. He just didn't get into that. He didn't criticize them and make a federal case out of all of these rules and regulations that seem to show up in the church. He wanted to get to know them. And so by doing that, he could build that relationship on grace. And grace, listen, folks, grace cares more about what's going on in the heart than it does about what you're wearing and what a person looks like on the outside. He wanted to know who they were. And that's exactly what happens when grace is built into our relationship. But not only the element of consideration, I want you to see the element of compassion. Now watch this in verse 13, back to Galatians chapter 4. He says, "You know that because of physical infirmity, I preached the gospel to you at the first." Now, Paul had a physical problem. He went to that area of Galatia and he had a problem with his eyes. We know that for sure. But look at verse 14. He says, "And my trial which was in my flesh, you did not despise or reject, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. So he had a problem with his eyes, but the trial was probably something else. The commentators say that when he landed there in Turkey, down in that west coast, it would be a lower elevation, swampy, marshy land. And he landed there on that coast. And while he was there, he probably was I was going to say infested with mosquitoes, but attacked by mosquitoes because of the elevation, swampy and marshy. There's going to be lots of mosquitoes. And he probably got malaria, and the malaria affected his eyes, and they could have been oozing or whatever. So he may have very well had something oozing from his eyes, and certainly not fun to talk about and not fun to look at either. But we see over in chapter 6 that he had difficulty in reading and writing because of his eyes. Something was affecting them. Now, verse 15. What then was the blessing that you enjoyed? For I bear you witness that, if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. He's saying that because they had experienced the grace of Jesus Christ, their relationship was not only filled with consideration, but it was full of compassion as well. And Paul is saying that in the fellowship of God's people, grace, when we've experienced it, flows out from us and flows into those people that God has brought into our lives, those people that we have the opportunity to impact. It was a relationship of consideration, and it was a relationship of compassion. And listen, think about this in terms of evangelism and drawing people to the church. Who doesn't want to be a part of a relationship that's filled with consideration and compassion? Who wouldn't want that? Now, Chris and I do a lot of marriage counseling, and any counseling we do, it's biblical counseling. We don't follow man's rules or books or anything. We go to the Word of God. But can you imagine the change that would make in marriages? I mean, total consideration for the other person and a compassion that's always there, always there. You know I'll be there for you no matter what. Count on me. I'll always care for you. Listen, that's the kind of relationship we all want, whether it's in the church, whether it's within our families, our children, and certainly in our marriages. It's grace, grace, grace. Love one another with grace. You see, it empowers your relationship. It strengthens your relationship. Relationships are empowered when they are infused with grace. That's the first point. Second point is this. Relationships are wrecked when grace is excluded. And Paul is going to tell us that when we set grace aside, for whatever reason, for any reason at all, when grace is set aside, it goes out of your relationships as well. And he's going to tell us what happens. Verse 15, it says, what then was the blessing you enjoyed? For I bear you witness that, if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Have I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? He's saying, I'm just telling you the truth here. How does a Christian have a relationship with someone? We build it with grace, in consideration and compassion. But that relationship is wrecked when you set grace aside for whatever reason. When it's set aside, that relationship is ruined. And these Judaizers want them to do exactly that. And in setting that grace aside and focusing on legalism, on the ritualism and ceremony, focusing on that outward appearance, they're setting the grace aside. Now let me show you two things that Paul is going to point out to them. He's going to tell them when there's no grace in your relationship, Your relationship is all about self-preservation. Go back to 15 again. He says, what then was the blessing that you enjoyed? He says, there was a point in time when you were saved that you were just so excited. And I think you'll pick up what I'm saying here, but you see somebody come to faith in Christ, there's an excitement that they have. They're just, when the doors are open, they're there. Church is going on, they're there. They're just excited about their newfound faith, and as well they should be. But something happens so oftentimes after about 5 years, that excitement sometimes wanes. It fades a little bit, and I've seen it time and again. But he says something has changed. Paul says you lost that excitement. What was it that happened to you? What changed you? Now it's about self-preservation. It's about what I want. It's about what I think. It's about what I need. And it's about, it's become more about what I think is best for me. We can get to the place, folks, where we no longer enjoy serving. Sad. That is sad, because you're not serving anybody but the Lord Jesus Christ. If you are, you're doing it wrong. But we can get to that place where we just no longer enjoy serving or teaching or even greeting, or whatever. Now, this is deep in Paul's thought process. Just turn over a page to chapter 5 for a minute and look with me beginning at verse 13. He says, "For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." The joy that comes from serving needs to be there. There's joy in the journey. It needs to be there. He says in verse 14 of chapter 5, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." He says, you have this relationship, but there's no grace. The grace has been set aside. Without the love, it becomes self-preservation. Now, go back with me to chapter 4, because I want you to see the manipulation that goes on here. He says, I'm going to let you in on a truth here that you need to understand. These people, these Judaizers who were bluffing their way into the fellowship, they're bluffing their way into the church. I just got my nose fixed and my tongue went, sorry. These people care about themselves. Now watch this in verse 17. He says, they zealously court you, but for no good. Yes, they want to exclude you, that you may be zealous for them. He's saying they could care less about you. They don't care about your needs or your struggles or your hurt. They don't care at all about you. What they want is another body on their side so that they can get what they want in the fellowship. The more people that are on their side, the easier it is to get what they want. And he says they zealously court you, but for no good. It's not for you. It's all about them. And when you get to be on their side, when they have you on their side, he says they don't have anything else to do with you. You see, folks, when you build a relationship apart from grace, it becomes all about self-preservation and manipulation. Now listen to this. This is so sad at any level. At any level. The church, the family, in our marriages, a relationship with our kids, because when we withhold affection and love to get people to do what we want, when we try to do it without grace, it leads to a self-preservation and a manipulation. Listen, our God never, never, never withholds his love from you and I. Never. And so, let's get to the good part. How do we get it back? How do we get it back? Get back to where we need to be? How do we get to where it's grace-motivated love and love-motivated grace? Well, Paul has a number of these churches in Galatia who are off outside of grace, and it's really destroying their witness in that area. So watch what he does here in verse 19. He says, "My little children, for whom I labor in birth again until Christ is formed in you." He says, I was there when you were birthed into Christendom. I was there when you were birthed as a child of God, but I feel like I'm in labor again. I feel like I need to try and, just point you back to the grace that is in Jesus Christ. Now listen, let me tell you something. The Judaizers were there for personal gain, but Paul was there for personal pain. He's hurting. He's hurting for these churches who had set grace aside. Folks, I've been in the church now since 1976. I have been around a long time, long enough to see what happens, to see it hurt a person or a church, to see a person or a church act in any way that is unchristlike. It's sad. It is so sad. And Paul wants them to get back to where Jesus Christ is Lord of all. He wants them to get back to where Christ was formed in them. Let me read the verse again. "My little children, for whom I labor in birth again until Christ is formed in you." Watch the verb tense here because it describes the embryo as it unfolds in the womb of the mother. In other words, he wanted that grace to unfold until it had become fully grown and matured in their lives. And folks, it comes out in the way we treat one another. It comes out in how we show Christ and his love to one another, or whether we have a personal agenda. It's going to come out. And he says, the only way for you is to get back into that grip of grace, to get back to Christ. We need that joy unspeakable and full of glory. Listen, I want my relationship to be what Christ's is to me. He gives himself unconditionally. He never leaves me. He never fails me. And if we do that, that will give us joy unspeakable and full of glory. And that's how my relationship, plural, relationships need to be. And the only way to do that is to keep going to the one from whom is the source of that grace. Let me close with a story this morning from the Civil War. It's a story about a guy by the name of John Gordon. John Gordon was a Confederate general, and he was in charge of an area that we know of as the Sunken Road in the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. Now, I love history, as most of you know. I love history, and I've made it a point to travel to a whole lot of these battlefields from the Civil War, to go to the museums and to check all this stuff out. I just find it fascinating. There is so much history, but so many, illustrations that are so rich, and this is one of them. So he was in charge of this area known as the Sunken Road there in Maryland, and this battle started. And by the way, that battle, there were over 23,000 people that were either killed or wounded. I mean, it was huge, huge. And it started up on this ridge. And as it progressed down the ridge, across the plain, and over to an area called the Sunken Valley, or the Sunken Road. And like I said, it was a massacre. The Union Army so outnumbered the Confederates that it was a massacre. I can't imagine people fighting like that. Well, General Gordon was shot 5 times, twice in the leg, once in the arm, once in his hand. And yet he continued to lead his troops, and they begged him to go and look after himself and begged him to leave, but he wouldn't do it until he was shot the 5th time, and he was shot in his face. The bullet went in one side of his cheek and out the other. And he survived. Actually, when the war ended, he was one of the ones that had surrendered. And he ended up going back to his home in Georgia. But there was an officer who had a vendetta against him. He hated him, despised him, and he wanted to embarrass him in any way he could. And he brought charges against General Gordon in a court-martial. And the charges were cowardice and desertion. And he just took that opportunity to say anything and everything he could against this general. But it was all lies. And as they were in that court-martial, he screamed at Gordon, "You stand up," because Gordon had spent the time with his head down and not looking and not watching. This guy stood up and he screamed at him. He said, "You need to stand up and look at me." And Gordon stood up and he slowly lifted himself, turned and faced the man. And as he did, that man saw the massive scars from the wound to his face. And the man suddenly broke down into tears. And as he looked at Gordon, he repented from what he had done. And as he walked out of that room, he looked at Gordon and he said, "I forgot about the scars. I forgot about the scars." You know, sometimes you and I need to be reminded about the scars that gave us grace. So we can take that reminder and then find it a whole lot easier to look at other people and other situations with a whole lot more grace. We need to look at the one who loved us and told us that we are to love one another. He loved us so much that he was willing to take those scars for you and I. Let's pray. Father, again, for your grace, for your love, we truly are thankful. I pray, Father, that as we take these words, as we've heard these words, Lord, that they would go deep into our lives, deep into our heart, so that you might get the glory. And we ask in Jesus' name, amen.